How are we today? I'm not going to apologize for last class, but I am going to say that it probably seemed somewhat oppressive because I was going through some material that is quite heavy and I was doing it fairly fast. And I do need to assure you that I do not expect you to have mastered Thomas Aquinas as a result of hearing me last week, our last class period. Because I certainly didn't master Thomas Aquinas in that length of time. And there's a little footnote under that, and that is I still have not mastered Thomas Aquinas. So if that was kind of oppressive to you, and if you thought, man alive, I can't possibly pass this course if I have to understand everything he said last time, then you need to be assured I couldn't pass this course if I couldn't understand everything that I said last time. I couldn't pass the course, and I'd be in trouble too. What I was trying to do was to get a bunch of stuff out on the table, and I think I did that. And so if you know something about Anselm and the ontological argument, then the reading that you will do that makes references to that, I think will be helpful, and what I said will be helpful to your reading. And the same thing is true about Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. One of the main points I was trying to make last time is that these ways are quite often, I think, misunderstood by modern scientifically minded people and some modern philosophically minded people. Though philosophers have a better opportunity to understand it than a lot of scientists do who do not really study the philosophy of science. And that is that these proofs for the existence of God have been fairly well demolished by early modern philosophers and later philosophers as proofs. Now, proofs is a very specific kind of thing. And what Hume did was to demolish any argument for existence as a proof. From his perspective, arguments for existence and proofs are different things. And therefore, he did not, as Madeline Murray O'Hare thought, disprove the existence of God. He simply showed the very problematic nature of attempting to prove the existence of God or to argue from the existence of God in terms of proofs. In terms of proofs, you cannot prove that your grandmother exists. That doesn't mean that you don't eat her apple pie when she brings you one. But proof is a very specific kind of operation. And you certainly don't establish the existence of God, the existence of the biblical God, which is what these people were talking about, by science or by philosophy. And that Aquinas held very little hope for what philosophy could do in terms of letting us know who the God of the Bible is. He believed philosophy could do some very limited things. That is, it could establish that God is one, first that he exists, and then second that he is one. Well, as Hume pointed out, he probably can't even establish that philosophically, because each of his 5 ways could be attributed to a different God. And so what Aquinas is doing at the end of each of his 5 ways is simply jumping to the conclusion that this we know as God, by which he means the Christian God. But I think that, I don't know what was going on in his brain, but I think that he probably could have acknowledged that even in his time, that his proofs were not philosophical or scientific establishments of the existence, certainly not the character or the personality of the God of the Bible. And Aquinas was really more interested in revelation than he was in philosophy. He was extremely interested in philosophy, and he's one of the great philosophical theologians of all time. But if you understand that he was more interested in revelation than philosophy, then you can put his arguments in perspective. The same thing is true with Anselm. Anselm was not as great a philosophical theologian as Aquinas, but as Karl Barth and other people have pointed out recently, his argument is within the context of a prayer. Pascal made the point, I quoted him last time and didn't mention his name. Pascal made the point that God, you do not find God at the end of a syllogism. Well, Pascal was one of the original Christian existentialists, and a great many Christian existentialists followed up on that all the way to Kierkegaard, who was a Lutheran Christian existentialist. And the point they were trying to make is that the attempts of philosophical theologians throughout the ages to prove the existence of God with some kind of scientific proof were failures. That, as a matter of fact, it was impossible, and it had nothing to do with whether God exists or not. Proving the existence of God is impossible whether or not God exists. And not only that, from the perspective of Pascal and Kierkegaard, it was actually kind of anti-Christian to try to prove that God exists, because it was a major waste of time to begin with. If you waited till you proved God existed before you had a relationship with him, then how long would you wait? You would certainly have to wait beyond this life, because nobody has been able to do that. Kierkegaard, for instance, was in reaction to Hegel, and Hegel is probably the philosopher who comes the closest to really believing that he had proved the existence of God and that he had actually described God and the process that God is going through. And he seemed to have believed that after he died we wouldn't need any more philosophers because he had already done all the work. Well, this kind of arrogance really was problematic for the Christian existentialist, or the fathers of Christian existentialism, who thought that that was arrogance. They noted, which I have noted several times, that there are no arguments in the Bible for the existence of God. The biblical writings begin with the assumption that God, not only does God exist, it doesn't discuss that subject, but not only does God exist, but that he has already made contact with human beings and established a covenant relationship with human beings. And so any statements in the Bible, such as when I look at your heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars that you have made, none of these observations are attempts at proof at God's existence. They are simply exclamations of praise at the recognition of God's existence. And for that reason, then, a great number of theologians throughout Christian history have not been interested in proofs for the existence of God. That would take too much time away from their relationship with God. So it's not just a philosophical problem, it's a theological problem, a religious problem. From their perspective, the only way you can know about the God of the Bible, which is all they were really interested in, was if the God of the Bible chooses to reveal himself to you. Not reveal propositions about himself or philosophical proofs of his existence, but to reveal himself. In other words, the God of the Bible was perceived in personal terms. You might say supra-personal terms, but at least personal terms. And you do not go around trying to prove another person exists before you have a relationship with him. So this is part of the confusion that some early modern philosophy brought to the question of the arguments for the existence of God. Whereas a great many Christian and Jewish theologians particularly never did get attached to the arguments for the existence of God movement. For instance, Luther wasn't interested in Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God because Luther was more interested in the existential relationship of God to humanity, and he was more interested in what God has revealed about himself. Luther assumed that philosophers were overstepping their bounds, not by being philosophers, but by assuming that through philosophy they could understand a great deal about the nature of God. And for Luther, most of God was the hidden God. And so, from his perspective, any philosopher who thought he knew much about God on the basis of human reason was just barking up the wrong tree. The only thing Luther says we can know about God is what he chooses to reveal to us, which means not very much. Yes?
Unfortunately, I missed the last class, but was this attempt to establish proofs of God, was that kind of a limited to a certain period of time, generally?
Well, the proofs for the existence of God are limited in Christian history to the time in which Christians paid most attention to Plato and to Aristotle, because both of their proofs, the ontological proof, or the proof from being, and the cosmological proofs, which were the proofs from existence, both of these proofs, the first comes from Plato and the second comes from Aristotle. So when Anselm put forth the ontological proof for the existence of God, which is very Platonic, he was immediately attacked by other Christian theologians. It's not as though Anselm produced the argument for the existence of God and Christians just wallowed in it the rest of their lives. Anselm was immediately attacked by other Christian theologians that his proof was not valid. And then later on, Thomas Aquinas, when he became acquainted with Aristotle, he considered Aristotle's proof for the existence of God to be valid, but Anselm's not to be valid. So even on which proofs for the existence of God are valid, there never has been a consensus among Christians. In fact, there's never been a consensus among Christians whether any proof for the existence of God is valid. And again, I want to emphasize, because this is so misunderstood by a lot of modern people in modern scientific culture. Because some of the best Christian theologians and some of the best contemporary Christian theologians believe in God, that does not necessarily mean that they have any truck with the arguments for the existence of God. And the other side of that is because they believe that the arguments for the existence of God are not valid does not mean that they don't believe that God exists. They just believe that these are two separate activities of the human being, and they assume that the way we know God is more in the Hebrew way of knowledge, which doesn't have as much to do with intellectual arguments as it does with experiential or existential relationship. And of course, I was raised in a fairly conservative Christian environment, and sometimes some of our preachers would get up, and they'd done a little reading the night before or something, so they would get up and try to expound the arguments for God's existence. Well, it was kind of odd to me that even though I believed in God's existence, their sermons didn't persuade me. And it was only later that I realized that most good Christian theologians and Jewish theologians alike are not really that interested in arguments for the existence of God. Now there is a renewed movement, a renewed interest in the ontological argument by some theologians, and in the cosmological argument, primarily the argument from design by some theologians. But even those theologians are now chastened arguers. They're chastened philosophers, in that they realize that whatever work they do is not going to produce an argument for the existence of God which is cogent enough to require acceptance by someone who does not believe in God. And one of the things I was trying to say last time is I think perhaps even the originators of these arguments, like Anselm and Aquinas, already knew that. That is, unless you begin with the definition of the Christian God, you don't come out with the conclusion of the Christian God. Because the Christian God, the only thing about him that are important must be understood as to be part of his self-revelation. And nature reveals very little about the nature or the character of the Christian God. All right, let's talk a little bit more now about the medieval worldview, upon which, on the basis of which these arguments were based on basically a medieval worldview, which were based basically on an Aristotelian worldview. And Aristotle related to Ptolemy. And we've already made the point that the reason why churchmen at the time of Galileo and Copernicus believed that the earth stood still and everything moved around the earth, that the earth was the center of the universe, was not because that was discussed in the Bible, but because that was the conclusion of Ptolemy and Aristotle. And so it was on the authority, the scientific authority of Aristotle, that people believed in that the earth was the center of the universe, both physically and metaphysically. And since the Bible has no physical science and it has little metaphysics, then this really has not much to do with the Bible. It has to do with a particular point to which medieval theology had come. Last time and time before, I showed you this world picture that comes from the Bible. And what I indicated is that in any age, you're going to have a different world picture. And the world picture of the Middle Ages is different from the world picture probably that the biblical writers had. It's similar in that probably the earth was kind of considered the center of everything, because human beings were kind of the center of everything physical. But in the Bible, the emphasis is not on the centrality of human beings, but on the centrality of God. So this physical picture would have really not much to do with their conception of God and their conception of his relationship. Except, of course, that by analogy, they would talk of God in language which, if it were univocal, that is, if it were literally understood, would make God into a big physical being, and the place where he lives into a physical place, and so forth and so on. And it's quite possible that a great many Christians throughout the centuries, particularly uneducated ones, theologically uneducated ones, would continue to hold such a view. But the Bible world picture was so malleable that as soon as Christians came into contact with Ptolemy's worldview, they just dumped it and went for Ptolemy's, went for Aristotle's, because since there was no world picture that was intimately connected with the Bible to the exclusion of anything else, as Christians came into other cultures, they adapted the world pictures that were meaningful to other cultures. And the world picture of Ptolemy is simply described as geocentric. Now it's geocentric in the physical sense, that is, that the earth is kind of the absolute center of the universe, and that it is a kind of a stage upon which the drama of human history takes place. It's not really a very permanent idea, this earth, in medieval Christian theology. It's more like a stage or a drama which began with creation and will end with the end of the world, and then basically the world which is at the center of the universe, the center of the physical universe, will not be the home of humanity, but they instead will find a home in another part of reality, which is sometimes called heaven. And so the earth is simply a stage of preparing human beings for heaven. As such, it's a very important place, but it is not the ultimate place. And since the earth is the abode of human beings, then the idea is that this stage has to be kind of stable, where people can actually do their thing on the surface of the earth. And this stability was even further enhanced by the Aristotelian and the Ptolemaic view that the earth was stable and just stood still, and everything in the universe went around it. Now, part of the problem of medieval people is that, in a way, medievalists were more anthropocentric than the biblical writers. And so many times the medievalists interpreted the Bible as if it were more anthropocentric than it was. The Bible is radically theocentric. And so everything in the Bible is related to God. And there is really no... So in the, if you want to call it the metaphysical, certainly the theological world of the Bible, the center of reality is God, and everything moves around God. That doesn't give you a physical picture, but it gives you a theological picture of how they considered things. So, in a sense, the biblical materials were not as humanistic as the medieval materials were in the later sense of the word humanistic. Obviously, the biblical people were humanists, but they weren't humanistic in the sense of medieval humanism, where everything was just kind of focused on human beings, and human beings were on a hierarchical ladder, and their ultimate goal was to move up to heaven, and there were even 7 heavens that you went through under certain schemes and so forth. But anyway, the focal point of the whole physical universe was the earth. Well, we no longer have that world picture. The focal point of the universe is actually not the earth physically. The earth seems to be off to one side in one small galaxy, in the midst of billions and billions and billions of galaxies, with billions and billions and billions of suns and Earths and Earth-like planets and so forth. And so that comes as a shock to our physical world picture. And that certainly came as a shock to the Aristotelian world picture, which was held by the medieval, great many of the medieval clergymen. Because that seems to indicate what? If the earth and human beings on the earth are not at the absolute physical center of the universe, then God is not illustrating his will very well. His will, if he was illustrating it well, he would have made the earth the center of the universe and human beings the center of the universe. In fact, this is one of the things that bothered Bellarmine about Copernicus and Galileo, is that Bellarmine thought that if you start believing this thing that Galileo is saying about the earth moving around the sun, then you might be opening the door for the possibility of other beings on other planets, other sentient beings on other planets. And he was correct, because modern Christian theologians have no less believe no less in the possibility of sentient beings on other planets than do humanistic or naturalistic philosophers. In other words, that in a sense, the knocking out from under the church of the Ptolemaic Aristotelian view of the earth as the physical center of the universe actually broadened Christians' view of God, so that God was not spending all of his time focused on the earth, but is in fact the God of the whole universe. And what he is doing in the whole universe, we have almost no idea. We have very little idea of what he's doing in this world. The only thing we know about what he's doing in this world is what he has revealed to us. And so there have been several very conservative Christian theologians in the 20th century who not only consider the possibility that there may be other intelligent creatures in the universe, but they've even written science fiction about them. So, but it still came as a tremendous shock at the beginning. And as W.T. Stace in his book The Religion in the Modern Mind reminds us, people's beliefs are not necessarily the result of a logical process. Many times, in fact most of the time, they're the result of a psychological process. And this was a blow to the psychological vision or picture that these folks had of human beings. Human beings are the greatest creatures in the universe. Well, that's a possibility, but it is not required by the biblical conception of the nature of man, nor the biblical conception of the nature of God. In fact, it kind of limits God in a certain way. But what happens when you lose your faith in the earth and human beings as being at the center of the universe? That, in a sense, pushes God a little farther away from us. Again, this is a psychological thing, not a physical thing. If you think of God as physical, then if the earth is not the center of the universe, then he really is physically pushed away from us. And so this kind of physicalization of the center of the universe as the earth comes as a psychological shock. Could it be that human beings are not the primary interest of God? If human beings are not the primary interest of God, then if they are the primary interest of God, then this old worldview would be more appropriate. If human beings are not the primary interest of God, then this worldview seems to indicate that he's certainly not nearly as interested as we used to think he was. And the idea that the universe is bigger, that comes with the rise of modern science, takes away the feeling that the earth is a stage and human beings are operating on the stage and God is a kind of observer who is involved in everything, but at the same time he's involved in a drama which is a few thousand years old. It began a few thousand years ago and it will end within a few thousand years. And the whole of the history of the universe is simply in order to carry out that drama. Well, when you start thinking of the universe as being tremendously more immense than we imagine, then that picture kind of fades a little bit. When you start thinking of the universe as being tremendously older than you imagine, then that kind of vision fades just a little bit. In other words, God and man become a little bit less intimate physically. Well, that really wouldn't bother the biblical people very much because even though they didn't know how immense the universe really is, because they did not have available to them telescopes and the mathematical proofs of later philosophers, they still thought it was pretty big. Because when they went out and looked, they saw the same thing we see. And if you go out and look, even if you're a little child, you have a sense of the amazing immensity and greatness of the universe. And if you're like me, when I was a child, one of the things I loved to do was just go out and lie on the hood of the car. Now, we could see the stars where I was born and raised. So I loved to go out and lie on the hood of the car and look up and just wonder at the vastness of the universe. I didn't know mathematically how vast it was. Still don't. But the people in the ancient world had a conception of the vastness of the universe, and so it shouldn't have made that much difference learning that it was vaster than we thought. And as a matter of fact, when Christians finally got over the shock that it was vaster than we thought, and that it was more complicated than we thought, they turned immediately to using those as arguments for the existence of God and for the greatness of God. So what happened in early modern philosophy is that the same arguments were used against the existence of God as were used for the existence of God. In other words, if the Earth is not the center of the universe and it's just a little thing bubbling around in one part of a galaxy in billions and billions, then that means that human beings are very insignificant. If human beings are so insignificant, then how can we think of God as paying any attention to human beings, much less of being their conscious creator and their redeemer and their savior? The problem with that early modern argument is that that argument was already used in a positive way in the Bible. Again, when I look at your heavens, the work of your hands, the moon and the stars that you've made, what is a human being that you're mindful of him? In other words, early modern atheistic philosophers did not invent the idea that human beings and the earth is so significant that it's a wonder that God is even concerned about it. And so in the Psalms, you have psalms which are praising God for the fact that his universe is so immense and so vast, and the earth and human beings are so small and insignificant. Why in the world is God even concerned with them? So you can have a philosophical argument against the likelihood that God exists, or you can have a psalm of praise, praising God for existing and yet still being concerned about insignificant human beings. Does everybody understand the parallel I'm drawing there? And that's actually what happened, of course, among Christian scientists, who were the only scientists for quite a while. They got over the shock. It took some of them a while to get over the shock. There were still some Christians in the latter part of the 19th century in America who still had not absorbed the shock that the earth was not the center of the universe. But most Christians learned that shock came as a shock to Aristotelianism, not necessarily to the biblical conception of God. Okay, does anybody have a question about that?
I had a question about the article.
Okay.
It says that Galileo says that the Bible is written for the common people.
Yes.
And mentions that a lot. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
All right. This is associated with two doctrines that were already in existence among theologians, and Galileo simply picked up on it. One is the doctrine of the two books. That is, that God has two books, the book of nature and the scriptures, and that the two books have to be read differently because they are written differently. And basically, in order to know what God wants you to learn from the scriptures, you have to study the scriptures, and that takes one kind of science. But if you want to know what God says through nature, you have to study nature, and that takes a different kind of science. And so it's not possible, from Galileo's perspective, for the human beings who were alive when the Bible was written to comprehend what can only be learned through a different scientific method which had not yet been established, much less developed. So, he says, if God wanted to reveal himself to those people, he had to reveal himself in an accommodationist way. That is, he had to accommodate himself to the language, to the culture, to the scientific knowledge of the people, which means that he's basically simply going to use in all cases possible simply ordinary language. Theological language is ordinary language. Religious language is ordinary language, but it is especially when it has to do with physical things. For instance, if you read Genesis 1 is talking about physical things, so it has a certain relationship to science, but it's not talking about these physical things in terms of a scientific method. What it's simply saying when it lists all the animals and plants and so forth that are created, what it's simply saying is, I don't have to tell you about the animals and the plants. You get up every morning and see the animals and the plants. All I'm telling you is that these animals and plants were the creation of God. For instance, in Genesis 1, he lists the wild animals and the domestic animals. Well, obviously, there was a time before there were any domestic animals. But that's not a subject of Genesis 1. The subject of Genesis 1 is how did all the things that you see when you walk out of your door in the morning come to be? They came to be because of God. He doesn't list dinosaurs for several reasons. One is because the author had no idea who dinosaurs were, and even if you consider the God to be the author, he was not dumb enough to mention dinosaurs. In other words, that's what it means to reveal yourself to the common people. Now, most theologians consider Galileo's argument in this regard to be extreme. That is, this view seems to be kind of artificial. That is, the authors of the books of the Old Testament could have given us all this scientific information, but they didn't. Whereas most people acquainted with psychology, anthropology, history, sociology, and all kinds of sciences realize that a scientific discussion of the modern type in the Bible would just be totally impossible. The only language they could have used is the language they knew. Theologically speaking, theologians say this is a kind of an accommodation, because the only way God can reveal himself to human beings is to accommodate in language. And in fact, from the Jewish Christian point of view, God chose a particular people, a particular culture, a particular language through which to reveal himself. And so if he reveals himself through those people, through that culture, and through that language, it's going to sound like the people who existed at the time this revelation took place. Does that help you with that idea? And a lot of that has to do with specific languages like Hebrew. In other words, you can't understand the biblical worldview without understanding Hebrew. You can't understand it if the only language you know is English or Greek. And so somebody has to know Hebrew and be able to expound the meanings of these words. But there's also the problem of language in general. That is, if you think only in univocal terms, that is, you think only when you read the Bible, you read it only as if it were literal, and that the words mean exactly the same thing as what you have in your mind, and they mean exactly the same thing wherever they're found in the Bible, then of course you're not going to be able to read the Bible that way either. You're going to have to learn to read in a very poetic way, and even an analogical way, in order to read the Bible. Since you can't turn to any chapter and read anything that would be like Copernicus's view of the universe, what you're going to read, you're going to have to understand as not scientific in its nature. When you read about God, you're going to have to learn to use symbolism and an analogy. Paul Tillich, the man I mentioned last time, makes the point that all words relating to God are symbolic. And he used to say, even the name God. But then he quit saying that, because all words relating to God are symbolic. The symbolism may be more the symbolism of an analogy, or it may be more the symbolism of what we today call myth, which doesn't, by the way, mean something is not true, as a lot of people think it means. It may be all kinds of ways in which language is used, but there's no way to univocally talk about God. When you try to talk about God, in fact, you're going to use usually anthropomorphic language. So there's language that sounds like you're talking about a big human being. And a lot of Christians who talk about God, that's what they're thinking about, is a big human being. A big human being. But that's not the theological understanding of God, and that's not the understanding of God in most of the biblical literature. Because these people, including medieval people, I believe, and you may want to argue with me, I believe that medieval people, educated medieval people, were much better able to think poetically and analogically than most modern people, even most educated scientists, because most educated scientists are thinking on the level of the scientific or the historical. And so that's the reason why sometimes scientists are not very good poets and don't like poetry. That's the reason why a lot of Americans are not very good poets and don't like poetry, because medieval people were more poets. They were more poetic. And in fact, the farther you go back, the more poetic people were. There is a theory that proposed by Owen Barfield quite a few years ago, that all language was originally pure poetry. And it's only been recently that language has been divided between poetry and non-poetry. So in order to read the Bible, then you have to have a kind of a poetic. You have to begin with a kind of a poetic turn. That's the reason why when you attach the Bible to any particular physical theory of the universe, you're going to run into a brick wall, because that's not broad enough use of language. That's not a profound enough use of language. Besides that, the medieval world picture doesn't fit the biblical worldview. The medieval world picture fits more the Aristotelian worldview. The biblical world picture, as I said, is a historical worldview. That is, history had a beginning, it will have an end, and every individual event in between the time is a unique event that has never happened before in the same way and will never happen again in the same way. Well, you can't get that from Aristotle or Plato. And so when you mix Aristotle and Plato in with Christian theology, some of that just kind of gets lost a little bit. For instance, we're going to talk about two other aspects of the medieval world picture. One is that the world is a purposeful world. That is, everything in the world has a purpose. In other words, they had a teleological worldview. Now, one thing that Jay Gould and most modern Darwinian scientists hate worse than anything in the world is somebody finding anything teleological in biology or in science. That's just anathema. And sometimes that leaves people with the impression, and I don't know, it may be the impression they're trying to leave, that there is nothing teleological. But the people in medieval times believed that the world had a purpose, and that every individual act in the world had a purpose, and every scientific process had a purpose. And the purpose of an acorn seed was to produce an oak tree, and then the purpose of an oak tree was to produce another acorn seed, and so on and so forth. And that implies something like a mind that is in charge of this whole thing, because purpose is an act of the mind, or is a part of the activity of a mind. And so it was very important for medieval people to think of the world as a place of purpose. It was also important for the medieval people to think of the world as a moral order. And that was still important for people even most early modern philosophers. It was important for them to think of the world as having a purpose and having a moral order. Kant, for instance, when he critiques pure reason and basically demolishes the old arguments for the existence of God, he still has an argument for the existence of God. What is it? He demolishes the physical, cosmological arguments for the existence of God, but he still has a moral argument for the existence of God. And it's a very interesting argument. Basically, it is that the world is a moral order. That just wasn't at issue. You can debate the character of God and whether he can be proved or not, but you can't possibly carry on in life or in civilization without the assumption that there's a moral order. And if there's a moral order, he said, then there has to be an immortality of some kind in order for the moral order to be fulfilled. And if there is an immortality of some kind, there has to be a being to guarantee immortality. And so, lo and behold, Kant has gotten rid of all the cosmological arguments for the existence of God, but he still has God out here guaranteeing the immortality that guarantees the moral order. So Kant hadn't gotten rid of the moral order, and a great many early modern philosophers did not. For instance, we make a great deal of the fact that some people make a great deal of the fact that the pioneers of American culture and society were all Christian people. Well, most of them were in a general sense. Certainly the Puritans were, and their descendants, and they had a great deal to do with the way our culture developed. But some of the people who were the founders of our country were also deists, and that comes from deists are basically very liberal Puritans who don't believe in the divinity of Christ and in miracles and so forth. In other words, they're basing their theology on the mechanistic worldview of Newton. But even they could not even conceive of the world not being a moral order. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So the concept of the world as a moral order was not substantially destroyed immediately by the Copernican and Galileo theses. In fact, to his chagrin, if he were still alive to see it, the world as a moral order was undermined more by Newton than by Galileo. because Newton's mechanistic view of the world, and that was the model that he had available to him to think of the world, was the machine. This was the beginning of the age of the machines. And so if you think of the world as a machine, you think of a world as being created that is wound up like a clock at the very beginning, and now it's running under its own steam. And God only intervenes every once in a while to kind of tap something back in place. But then when scientists figure out that God doesn't even have to intervene to tap something back into place, then God is kind of sitting up in heaven with his hands crossed. And that's basically the deistic view of God. There had to be a God, or there wouldn't be a moral order. But he doesn't have much to do with the world and the way it operates, because the moral order has most to do with human will and human action. Just because the law, the world is a moral order, does not mean that all human beings are moral. So the moral order kind of serves as an ideal guaranteed by God, and it's an ideal to which we strive, and that's related to the idea of natural law. The laws of nature and natural law are two different things. The law of nature, like gravity, you can't break the law of gravity. You can only conform to it. Somebody says, well, when I jump off a cliff, I'm breaking the law of gravity. No, you're not. You're demonstrating the law of gravity. But a moral law is a different kind of thing. A moral law is something that can be broken. And the great cosmic drama that's going on the earth is this cosmic drama of moral law. Are human beings going to be and act the way God wants them to be and act, or are they going to do otherwise? And ultimate reality, that is, what happens after this world, is simply divided very starkly between heaven and hell, between salvation and damnation. And so everything in the world is supposed to be subordinated to those stark facts, heaven and hell. So in that sense, this world is not really the center of medieval thought. The next world is the center of medieval thought. And best-selling books during the Middle Ages were books on how to die. Death was not cosmetically covered like it is in our society. It was hard to do that, since most people who were born died while they were still children. Most people died when they were still children. And those that lived had an average lifespan somewhere in the 20s. And that didn't mean there weren't people who lived very old, but those were few and far between. And so death was an ever-present reality. And then, of course, medieval thought was also impacted tremendously by the plague, by the Black Death, that took away a large percentage of European population. So there wasn't any problem in medieval times thinking about death. Therefore, there wasn't too much of a proclivity to think about the fullness of life in terms of the physical life, because there wasn't any of it. There just wasn't. There wasn't much of it. Even furniture in the Middle Ages was not built to live on, to sit on, because comfort wasn't nearly as important to people in the Middle Ages as it is to us today. I don't know whether you've ever visited any European castles and seen the beds that kings slept on. Man alive, it looks like even they could have had a little bit better sleep technology or furniture technology. But this life was just a hard life. And any English medieval king would have traded places with anybody in this room if he had known what kind of comforts and what kind of enjoyments, physical enjoyments, and what we expect out of life. Because they didn't expect any of that out of life. It was a hard road. You're born and you die. And so you have so little time in between your birth and your death. You better do something spectacular so that when you do die, you won't be part of the overwhelming mass of humanity who descends into hell. Modern science, by kind of breaking up a log jam at the end of the Middle Ages, actually did a tremendous amount for Christian thought, because it enabled Christians to look at the world in a different way from the kind of stagnant way that had kind of accumulated at the end of the Middle Ages. There are probably, in fact, a lot of modern scientific people, in arguing against the argument from design, argue two things that Christians have been worried with ever since the beginning. One is the problem of suffering. Now, we had largely forgot how big a problem the problem of suffering was during the 18th and 19th century, because we didn't suffer near as much as they did in the Middle Ages. And so when Darwin kind of rediscovered the problem of suffering by looking at the suffering of the whole of the animal kingdom and so forth that was involved in the theory of evolution, some scientists think that they rediscovered the problem of suffering, and so that's one of the primary arguments against any argument for design. If God was a good God, he would have designed the world so that it would evolve in a way that involved less suffering. Well, there are no modern scientists that has the burden of the problem of suffering like medieval people did. And if they believed in God, it was in spite of an incredible vision of suffering. And so the problem of suffering is still a problem that Christians have to deal with. But the problem of the goodness of life and the goodness of the material world and the goodness of everyday work and the goodness of human creativity was eclipsed by this dreaded life that people experienced. And so in a sense, religious people have been set free to a certain extent to appreciate the biblical emphasis on the goodness of life and the goodness of this world, and not just totally concentrated on the next world as the only place where there'll be anything good. So you had to do something spectacular, which is one of the things that Luther reacted against, because he considered that to be a justification by works and not by grace. And you also had to die well. Dying well was very important, because part of this medieval worldview is that almost everybody, if they didn't go to hell, almost all of the rest of them went to purgatory when they died. And I have a collection of funeral cards that come from the 50s and 60s. And every one of those funeral cards is a prayer for the person to be let out of purgatory as soon as possible. So that is still a vision of the world that predominates in a lot of Christianity. That is, that not only are you going to be in trouble most of this life and suffer most of this life, but you can well expect to suffer after this life for quite a while, even if you're going to go to heaven finally. And so you can see how oppressive that might have been to people. And so the medieval doctrine of hell, which we may talk about later, the medieval doctrine of hell, which is not the biblical doctrine of hell, but is a Latin doctrine of hell, has been one of the most oppressive of Christian doctrines. And even when biologists talk about why they don't, why they personally don't believe in God, sometimes it has to do simply with the problem of suffering or the problem of hell. And so that is a problem. A Christianity in which God created almost everybody in the world to go to hell and burn forever and ever and ever and ever and ever is going to be a problematic theology for modern people. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes?
Did you say that geocentric meant was the world picture of Ptolemy?
Yes.
Can you explain
Okay.
Ptolemy? I'm not familiar with that.
Ptolemy is an Egyptian from Alexandria, Greek cultured, Hellenistic Egyptian, who put forth the theory of the earth, which was still held by medieval people at the time of Copernicus. Copernicus held it most of his life. And so it's not all that dumb to hold the geocentric view of the earth. But let me read, let me let you look, first of all, at a book which I've well used by Jacob Bronowski called The Ascent of Man. And this is another one of those series that was produced a few years ago, like Sagan's Cosmos series. Bronowski was one of the great mathematicians of the 20th century, and he was also a scientific naturalist. That is, he did not believe in God. He was Jewish background, but one of the things that brought about was so oppressive that it brought about his disbelief in God was, of course, the Holocaust, in which a great part of his family were murdered. But just like Sagan, when he writes on the ascent of man, he has to make some theological judgments. He doesn't believe there's a God, but he has to make some theological judgments. And he also has to make comments about religion. And this is what he says about Ptolemy. The model of the heavens that Ptolemy constructed is wonderfully complex. Bronowski likes wonderful scientific theories. But it begins from a simple analogy. The moon revolves around the earth, obviously. Isn't that obvious? But not only that, but the sun revolves around the earth, obviously. That's all you've ever seen is the sun going around the earth. It seemed just as obvious to Ptolemy that the sun and the planets do the same. The ancients thought of the moon and the sun as planets, by the way. The word planet just means something that moves. So one of the planets was the moon and one of them was the sun. And that really makes the earth the center of everything because everything else is a planet. Only the earth is not a planet. The Greeks also believed that the perfect form of motion is a circle. And so Ptolemy made the planets run on circles, or on circles running on other circles. To us, that scheme of cycles and epicycles seems both simple-minded and artificial. Yet, in fact, the system was a beautiful and a workable invention, and an article of faith for Arabs and Christians right through the Middle Ages. Well, I think that is a respectful statement of Ptolemy's system, But what is interesting is that when he gets to Galileo, the people who still believed that were ignoramuses who could not use their brains for anything. That's kind of Bronowski's view of what happened at the time of Galileo. In fact, let me read you what he says about the good Bishop Ussher on page 343. He said, transmutation was, of course, an age-old dream. But to men like me, with a theoretical bent of mind, what was most exciting about the 1930s was that there began to open up the evolution of nature. I must explain that phrase. I began here by talking about the day of creation. I will do that again. Where will I start? Archbishop James Ussher. Now, I don't know why you would start with Archbishop James Ussher if you're going to talk about creation. But does anybody remember that name? Who was Archbishop James Ussher? If you have any old King James versions of the Bible, on the first page where it has Genesis, there will be a number at the top, 4004 BC. In other words, whoever owned that copy of the King James Version assumed that that number, that date, was part of the Bible, 4004 BC. That, of course, is not part of the Bible, and it's not found in any Bibles anymore, unless they're in certain sects that produce Bibles, and that doesn't usually happen. That date was devised by Archbishop Ussher of Armagh in Ireland. He was a British Anglican Archbishop of Ireland. Archbishop James Ussher of Armagh, a long time ago, about 1650, that's pretty close to our date here, isn't it? Said that the universe was created in 4004 BC. Armed as he was with dogma and ignorance, he brooked no rebuttal. Now, what's wrong with that sentence? Is that an objective scientific statement? Or is that saying nasty things about Archbishop Ussher because he believed the world was 6,000 years old? It doesn't dawn on Bronowski later in the book to let us know that Copernicus also believed that the world was just 6,000 years old, and so did Newton, and yet these are the great minds of the history. In other words, religious people at the time of Galileo just don't get any breaks. They don't get any slack. In other words, they believed this beautiful Ptolemaic system. But when they believe it, it's because they are ignorant. And they believed that the world was only 6,000 years old, but when they believed it, it's because they were ignorant. Well, that was ignorance with which Galileo continued to have the rest of his life, and Newton. The fact of the matter is that it did not take ignorant people in the Middle Ages to believe the earth stood still. It took educated people. The uneducated people didn't even consider the subject. They were too busy doing other things. And it's especially telling for someone to talk about Bishop Ussher armed with ignorance only, because Bishop Ussher was, as far as we can tell, the most educated human being alive at the time. He knew he had mastered 18 languages, most of them dead languages, ancient languages. He was the most well-educated person in languages and in the Bible. But there was nobody, however well educated at the time, who had any information that would have given them any idea that the earth was more than 6,000 years old. So all Bishop Ussher was doing was trying to read the Bible and tried to find out a more precise date. And he came up with 4004 BC. And if you if you have available to you the chronologies of, not the genealogies of the Bible, then you can come up with that date. The problem is, of course, as any Bible scholar can tell you, a genealogy is not a chronology. Genealogies were written for a certain purpose, chronologies were written for another purpose. But even if you had chronologies in the Bible, they would still have to be understood in the light that we were just talking about, in terms of the fact that nobody at the time the Bible was written would have had any idea that there might have been chronologies that existed before the time of Abraham. So just what I'm trying to do is just to give you an image here of a brilliant man, Jacob Bronowski, but he doesn't have any sensitivity toward why religious people would still believe this. And what he doesn't indicate is that religious people believed this because there was no other option. And when Galileo put forth his option, he couldn't prove it. And so it took a while for both religious and there weren't many non-religious people, but it took a while for people to kind of allow it to soak into their brain. And that's the reason why in the first class I said that whether you believe the earth stands still or whether you believe it goes around the sun has nothing essentially to do with your intelligence. It has everything to do with your chronology, that is, when you were born and what kind of education you got. So I hope you're not going to find, I haven't written my book on this subject yet, so you're not going to find a book in which anybody brags on Bishop Ussher. Because he has become the symbol of ignorance, when if you actually lived in the same town with Bishop Ussher, you would realize that he was a mind of immense character. He wasn't a mind who had the information that later scientists have, who do not have minds near his. And so that's the kind of psychological prejudice that sometimes still exists about this period. Yes.
Were there any theological type arguments against his views of the age of or was it pretty much widely accepted?
No, it was widely accepted. It was widely accepted. There wasn't. Now, some fundamentalists, interestingly enough, have developed arguments against his view. And this is what is called the gap theory of creation. Some fundamentalists have discovered that they cannot possibly fight the geological ages. So they developed a gap theory. That is, that there was a creation before the one that's described in Genesis 1. And that gives them immense time before that. Because the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth became void. Boy, they put millions of years right in that little gap. But they still hold that our present system is only a few thousand years old. Even they sometimes will let them have 10,000 years or 20,000 years. But what they don't understand is that if you allow 20 to 100,000 years, then you allow for all of the history of the kind of human beings that now rule the world. And so they really shouldn't have that much of a argument against modern science. But those are some of the intricacies we're going to get into later on, because we're going to talk about the creationist or the fundamentalist view of creation. And one of the problems that we're going to show is that sometimes people make the mistake of thinking because a person is a creationist that he's dumb or that he's uneducated. but a great many creationists have PhDs from our better universities. And so you better not begin with that assumption, or you'll get in trouble like some people have in debating them. That doesn't mean that I agree with their viewpoint, but the idea we kind of have that scientifically minded people are brilliant and others are not is just non-historical. Thank you.